Well, hello everyone. I have a signal that we are live. This is season two, week 18 of the 1960s project. May. May is for Malcolm X because he had such a huge influence on so many people in the 1960s, and it's also the month of his birthday. And May is also for mothers. So, small memories and large thoughts about the 1960s project are shared here. I am Faye Paige Edwards, and Jerome Page is the founder of the 1960s Project, and he is one of my two brothers. And I have been in this seat as a host before, and so I'm very happy to be back today in celebration of all of the women who mother. While we give people a few minutes to join us, I'm going to make a few announcements. If you have any thoughts or memories of the 1960s that you would like to share, we'd love to have you. So just let me know and I'll hook you up. And you guys know how social media works. We need likes, we need shares. What's on Jerome's Mind, or WOJM, is the name of the Facebook page, the Instagram page, the website, and YouTube. Now, when you go to YouTube, we want you to also like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. On the website, there are blog entries, and you are invited to read and comment on the blogs. So, about today's conversation, most people who know me know that I am one of the original organizers of the Girl Trek movement. You can follow us at girltrek.org. And Girl Trek has blessed me with friendships with some of the most amazing women on the planet. And so today I will be sharing the screen with one of them, and her name is Marcie Thomas. Ty, you want to bring up Marcie?
Hello.
Hello. Well, I think the last time we were physically in each other's presence, it was in the Rocky Mountains at the annual Girl Trek stress protests, where about 500 women take over the Estes Park Y outside of Denver, Colorado, for an amazing weekend of self-care and self-discovery. And Marcie and I, we always love it when we can actually see each other. It's always better in person. And let me kind of introduce you to Marcie. She has multiple talents in her spare time. Now, I want to emphasize spare time, y'all. She is the founder of Brown Girl Collective and the Brown Girl Collective, or BCG Book Club. And she's also an amazing artist. So, Marcie, why don't you tell us a little bit about Brown Girl Collective?
Great, I'd love to. Now, Brown Girl Collective is my baby that actually will be celebrating its 12th anniversary in July of this year. And basically what it is a space where I love talking about and sharing stories of Black women historically, things that we're doing in the here and now, and just really presenting the best of who we are to the world. And in the time since I started it almost 12 years ago, I managed to gather a following of about 493,000 followers on Facebook.
Would you say that again? How many followers do you have?
93,000 organically, not paid for. Organic followers, as well as having a little shy of 18,000 on Instagram. But as I said, it's just a place to celebrate Black women. My tagline is bold, brilliant, and beautiful, which we all have boldness, brilliance, and beauty in all of us. So that is what I do with that. And about a year ago, I would say August of last year, April of last year, I launched the BGC Book Club, which is a space where we get together and we have authors come on and just talk about books that were written by, for, and about Black women. So those are just a couple of things I have going, and there's always more to come as far as that's concerned, especially as we're entering into our 12th year.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, you're also an amazing artist with an amazing story about how you gave yourself permission to be an artist.
Yes, and a couple, you can't really see them because of my big head, but there are a couple of my pieces are behind me. Several years ago, I discovered that I enjoy painting by going to like some of the paint and sips. I know a lot of people do the paint and sips nowadays. And I went to some several times, so much that one of my friends was like, you could probably either teach the class or do something because you're always at paint and sip. So I would say 3 years ago, it was 3 years ago, I decided for Mother's Day to create something for my mom. From on my own, not anyone directing me or showing me what to paint. And I got a big, actually it's a 3 feet by 3 feet, 30, I can't talk today, a really big canvas basically. And I painted a picture of basically this myself, my mother, and my grandmother, who's now deceased, in front of my grandmother's home, and presented it to my mother for Mother's Day. And I mean, she cried. I mean, the ugly Oprah cried. I'm like, Mom, what's going on? Exactly. So after that happened, I'm like, I could be on to something. So once again, back to Girl Trek and stress protests. We were at the stress protest in 2018, and I shared my painting with some of the ladies there, what I had given my mom, and they were like, hey, you've got something going on with that. So fast forward, and I just started creating more pieces of art, and in that time frame, I have had the opportunity to also be a part of a couple of shows when I was living in Savannah. I'm now outside of Atlanta, so I haven't, jumped in with that yet, but it's coming.
Well, Marcie, I don't know any other careers launched at Paint and Sip. I've been to. I just think that's just a wonderful, wonderful story, and I'm so glad you're here today for us to talk about Malcolm X, the mothers of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and James Baldwin. Multiple forces deny the humanity of Black women. And this book is just packed with so many facts and historical context. It's like she wrote 3 biographies and then squeezed it all into this one book. So it's so much information. We've decided on the format of discussing Alberta, Louise, and Berdis. One, we will talk about their ancestry. They knew their worth because they knew the worth of their ancestors. And the second part of the framework will be that they were all educated women and that they passed the wealth of education to their children. And then thirdly, we'll talk about family life. So, structural sexism and structural racism, it wages a war on our souls and our minds. And sometimes it's waged by white people, and sometimes it's waged by men. And we can't be too sexual, we can't be too outspoken, and we are socialized to believe that male leadership is the most valued. So when the 1960s Project decided that May would be for Malcolm, I suggested his wife be included, Betty Shabazz. And then while browsing my local Black bookstore, I came across the book of the 3 mothers. So I had to ask myself why I had not been curious about Malcolm X's mother. Because y'all know, I like to think of myself as an unapologetic Black feminist, but yet I hadn't thought to celebrate his mother. And so that's what happens with the war. It affects our thinking, and even we who are supposedly woke, it diminishes our desire to be inquisitive about other women. But fortunately for me, the ancestors sent me the book, The 3 Mothers, and it is a love letter to unsung Black mothers. And these are about mothers who reframed oppression so that their children would have an antidote to white supremacist ideology. And they embedded in their children a concern for all Black people. And while this may seem like Black girl magic, it is not magical at all. It is very intentional. And the pain that they endured just should not be required. So these great men did not appear fully formed. Their mothers guided them as they did their other children while they took care of their husbands and managed to keep their identity intact in a world that's designed to destroy it. So the heavyweight on gender and race, Anna Malika Tubbs, that brought us the book, is an amazing woman. And Marcie, you want to tell us a little bit about her?
Absolutely, absolutely. The author of the book, Anna Malika Tubbs, she is an advocate, an educator, and a scholar who is currently a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Cambridge in England. She grew up in, yes, yes. So she's a heavyweight. She grew up in Dubai, Mexico, Sweden, Estonia, and Azerbaijan. She has been influenced by a lot of different cultures and beliefs and inspired to bring people together through the celebration of difference. She herself was motivated by her own mother's work advocating for women's and children's rights around the world. And she uses an intersectional lens to advocate for women of color and educate others, especially the pervasive erasure of Black women, which of course this book gets into that, and we'll talk more about that as we go.
Okay, so I'm so happy that we found this book. And we're going to start off by talking about James Baldwin's mother, Berdis Baldwin. And so who was Jimmy Baldwin's mama, who prepared him not just to be an eloquent advocate for Black people, but to also stand up and challenge homophobia. So just imagine the courage it must have taken in 1956 to be openly Black, male, and gay, and to write about homosexuality. He also, in his book, Nobody Knows My Name, he questioned the term illegitimate child. So if you Google his mama, the first thing that pops up is that she was an unwed mother. Then pop up that she was an amazing writer or that she was an amazing poet. And so to all of you who are listening, who has judged a mother based on her marital status? Y'all know, where's the daddy? Why she get pregnant? Why didn't she use protection? Loose woman. So I just would challenge us all to maybe remove that lens of superiority, especially if you've only had sex when you absolutely should have, because it is just so unfair and an example of sexism. James Baldwin was very bitter and angry, and he found it very difficult to control his anger. He had multiple mental breakdowns, but because of the role of his mother, she modeled the ability to bounce back again and again and to always move forward. So she just was an amazing woman. You want to tell us a little bit about her ancestry, Marcie?
Absolutely, absolutely. Berdis was born and raised on an island not too far from Baltimore, Maryland. Where she lived, there were a lot of natural disasters that resulted from being surrounded by water. And anyone who's been on an island and spent time, you know that water can come in and change things very quickly. The very small population that they had and the isolation of their island made it very necessary to sometimes work across color lines. So that's something that was very different, especially at the time that she would have been born, to live in a community where people were actually doing more working together than not. Berdis's father, Alfred, was a waterman, which is basically one of the few things that they could do on this island, either be a waterman, a sailor, or a shipbuilder. That's pretty much the options that they had. So Alberta herself, spent a lot of time on the water with her father. Also, an interesting note is that they were adjacent to the people of African descent who moved freely at that time, who were called the Blackjacks. So that was something that was new. I wasn't aware of the Blackjacks and what they did. Basically, they were Black merchants who were granted citizenship and known as America's first Black citizens. The U.S. government issued a verification called a Seaman's Protection Certificate that allowed them to move about freely. And they were also known as the Blackjacks. So they traveled the waters to distant places. And well, some may know, some may not know that Frederick Douglass actually escaped to freedom by wearing a Blackjack uniform and carrying a Seaman's Protection Certificate. So that's a bit of the background that Berdis Baldwin carried.
Yeah, so she was in her from her early years, she was surrounded and watched people who were free and how they moved about. Um, the book wasn't real clear on how she managed to get educated, but she was very well educated and she loved writing and she loved poetry. And so she also educated her children. She encouraged James' writing as well as his interest in theater. And there was also a white teacher who supported the family and helped him develop his talent. But the teacher and all who knew her said that Berdis would write letters constantly, and everyone always agreed that she was an incredible writer. She was the daughter of Leah and Alfred. And Leah died shortly after Berdis was born, but her father had fostered a strong bond of faith and love between this family of 5 children. But then he got married again, and so she went to live with an aunt. When she was a very young woman, she courageously migrated alone to New York City. And that's when she gave birth to her son, James. She then marries a man who she thinks loves them both. And at the time, he did. But the family has severe financial struggles and they move around a lot. Her husband's mental illness grows worse. He is traumatized by broken dreams and decay, and he becomes bitter and very abusive to the family. However, Berdis still managed to protect her children. She taught them to always care for the family and others. And she consistently demonstrated this unbelievable ability to love and to forgive and to keep moving forward. So his mental illness and tuberculosis gets diagnosed very late and he dies. So at 41, she finds herself to be a widow with 9 children. However, she still managed to encourage her children to proceed along their path of education. Now, James Baldwin says that he never had a childhood, and that's because he helped to raise his 8 sisters and brothers, and his life was one of poverty and police encounters. But yet, through the love and direction of this woman, he was able to become one of the most influential novelists, playwrights, essayists, poets, and activism. Marcie, you want to introduce Alberta King for us?
I'd love to, and it's especially important to me living in Atlanta now. So,
home of the King,
I have access to a lot of the things that happen around the King family. Now, who was it that would have demonstrated the idea that white people might embrace social justice if Black people protested in a nonviolent manner and acted respectable under all circumstances? When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of a deeply rooted American dream and said, "One day this nation will rise up and live up to its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." This was the dream of his mother, Alberta King. So let's know a little bit about where she came from and what her history is, Faye.
Okay. So Alberta is the daughter of John and Jenny. And their story starts in Atlanta and the family stays in Atlanta. There is no information if they knew the specifics of their African ancestry or if they knew how their family became free. But though they were not wealthy, and while obviously limited by racism, Jenny, who was Alberta's mother, her lineage was one of financial stability. So they lived on Auburn Avenue. Now, Auburn Avenue was eventually destroyed by white terrorists, but before that, it was known as, quote, the richest Negro street in America. You want to talk a little bit about their education, Marcie?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, of course, we all know that the King men, father and son, and actually both sons were involved in the ministry as preachers. But we also find in the book that Martin Luther King's grandmother, Jenny, the mother of his mother, was educated to be a minister as well. Before she married the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Jenny Celeste graduated from the Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary, which we now know as Spelman. So that's a part of the history. Of course, during that time, one of the main things was to get, you have a daughter, you get that daughter married. Many times they went to school to learn and, interact with men for the purpose of ultimately getting married.
However, the BA and the MRS.
Yeah, exactly. However, Celeste did not want her daughter to marry until her education was complete. So that's something that was different. And Alberta, Dr. King's mother, earned her college degree, which was a teaching certificate. One of the things I also found interesting about that is that it was fine to teach until you got married, and then you had to give up your career. So I said, that's interesting. So when Alberta met Michael King at the time, who later became Martin Luther King Sr., he was illiterate, actually. And she was played an integral role in tutoring him and helping him to get educated, and ultimately wind up becoming the pastor of her parents' church, Ebenezer Baptist Church. And in addition to that, Alberta was an incredible musician, instrumentalist, and vocalist who led the church choir, which went on to become famous.
Yes, she was a very famous vocalist. So the King family, unlike Berdis Baldwin, who needed to migrate to look for a better life, the King family stayed in Atlanta during the Great Migration. And of course, their economic stability and their community connections were probably factors. I mean, they didn't need to leave to get a better life. They were okay, not wealthy, but they were okay. And their family life, both of them, John and Jenny, approached life with love, faith, and vision. And they were very much into Black businesses and real estate. And at that time, it was very radical to join the NAACP. And they were among the founders, some of the very first members of the NAACP. So Alberta grew up watching her parents fight against racial injustice. Now, one of the things that the book does really effectively is to give a history of what is going on at the time. And it's worth it just to read all the backstories. So, there's the lynchings, there's discrimination, and there's unbelievable historical racial turbulence. However, young Martin Luther King, he had a pretty stable family life. The book talks about how sit-down dinners were mandatory. And just in contrast, you'll hear a little later about Malcolm's childhood and James Baldwin's family. They were wondering if they were going to have dinner.
Right.
And so another thing I found interesting was the book talks about the distress of young Martin when he aged out of being able to play with white kids. So he spent, until he got too old for that, he spent, he played with white kids as well. And as we've already heard, poor James Baldwin, he said he didn't even have a childhood as well. Alberta was an only child. All of her siblings died young. And she was very much known as a prayer warrior, a praying sister, a praying woman. And she believed that if you did not include racial justice in your faith, then it wasn't the real deal. And she believed that the hearts of white people could be changed with love, nonviolence, and if people dedicated themselves to uplifting the race. And while, of course, she did not deny racism, she felt her family was an example of an uplifted family, and that had given them a stable life. So she then prepared her son to become one of the most visible spokesperson of the civil rights movement. But I want to add a little historical note here, is because there was also a grandmother of the civil rights movement, and her work was commonly underappreciated by Southern male activists. If you do not know the name Septima Poinsetta Clark, you should put that on your list of people to find out about, because it was her literacy and citizenship workshops that made the activism of Martin Luther King possible. And he did acknowledge her sometimes, but history has been very, very negligent in terms of giving her her due. So the name Septima Poinsetta Clark. Why don't you tell us a little bit now about Malcolm X's mother? Again, the 1960s project is all picked Malcolm because so many people have said that the autobiography of Malcolm X just had a profound influence on them. And so what role did his mama play in, in making him a great man?
Wow, she played a really important role. Just prior to this, just as a quick sidebar, of course, if you've seen any of the films about Malcolm X, or, a lot of times, as we stated early on, his mom, we just don't know a lot, or the part that we do see is so limited that it paints her as a one-dimensional being, but she was far from a one-dimensional being. She was the one who prepared Malcolm to adopt strict religious practices through teaching her children about different religions, whether it be Christianity or Islam, or just religion in general. She was very passionate about not eating pork.
No pig.
Yeah, wasn't eating pig. Even before, way before Malcolm would, go on to embrace Islam. In the words of Malcolm's brother Filbert, they were definitely taught Islam by their mother. And everything that happened to her happened because the devils knew that she was not deadening their minds. All of our achievements are mom's, for she was the most faithful servant of truth years ago. I praise Allah for her. And once again, that's a quote from one of her sons. Who prepared Malcolm to embrace Pan-Africanism and start the Organization of African American Unity? And to say, and these are the words of Malcolm, to educate a man is to educate an individual, but to educate a woman is to educate a whole nation. That was Louise Little, who played an important role in all of those things and much more.
Much more. So she was really the book of all the mothers. They paint her as being the most aware of her African ancestry. So she was aware that her parents had come to the island of Grenada from Nigeria, but that doesn't mean they were Nigerian. Because we know that enslaved persons were marched as much as 300 miles before they actually were put on a ship. She's very aware of her African ancestry, and she belonged to a community that was known as, quote, liberated Africans. So her grandparents, Jupiter and Mary Jane, they were on a ship. They'd been captured, and they were on a ship from Nigeria. And they were headed from Grenada to become enslaved persons. And the Royal Navy at that time was trying to disrupt enslavement. And I'm not really clear on the history. We'll have to Google that to get some more specifics. But anyway, all of the Africans on the ship with Jupiter and Mary Jane were freed. And although the vast majority of Africans in Grenada were enslaved, there was always this community of liberated Africans, of which her family was a part of it. And a historical note was that in 1700, on the island of Grenada, there were 525 enslaved persons. 53, though, were considered colored or free persons of African descent. And also, that island, freedom came to them much sooner than it came to the United States. Everyone was freed there in 1838. And as you guys well know, the 13th Amendment did not happen until 1865. And it was another 2.5 years before word reached Texas, and thus Juneteenth. So Louise had this very specific pride in her ancestors. She was very immersed in the stories of freedom, and people who fought for their freedom was very much a part of her growing up. Want to talk a little bit about her family life, Marcie?
Absolutely, absolutely. Louise was raised by her grandparents, who had 6 children in total. Even though they were liberated, as Faye has already stated, there was racism. Just like today, we're liberated, but we're still dealing with racism. Not much is known about her mother, except that she was conceived when, that Louise was conceived when she was approximately 11 years old and when she was raped by a white man. So one of the things when you describe Louise, they talk about her being a very fair-skinned woman. And as many of us know, a lot of times when you see the people who are very active in the movement, they are those people who may have the opportunity to pass, but choose not to. They embrace their Blackness and they embrace the pride of who they are. Louise's family acquired land and built a home that housed their family for many, many generations. And their life was more comfortable and more autonomous than many of the neighbors that were around them. And they planted and hunted for their own food. I mean, they were pretty much able to sustain themselves. As Faye already mentioned, that they knew the history of resistance on Grenada. And as her grandfather was a carpenter, her grandmother was a domestic known for her resourcefulness. And they also had an aunt who was a seamstress who earned her own money. So basically everything that they had need of, they were in a position to provide for themselves.
Yeah. So yeah, that whole self-reliance thing that is part of Islam and most Black liberation movements, it was demonstrated to him at a very early age. Right. Now, Louise was really educated, and she may have been one of the smartest sisters on the planet. She spoke 5 languages. And she educated, and the book talks about that she was much more educated than her husband. He was not illiterate, but she was by far the education influence in the family. And she educated her children to love reading and to write. And she, from a very early age, taught them to question white people. So the book describes how when they would come home from school every day, she would ask them what they learned, and then she would reteach it to remove the layers of whiteness so it would be clear. And that becomes really critical later on when social services is trying to disrupt the family and they want to take her away. Oftentimes when things like that happen, you believe the doctors. And you believe the quote experts, but they knew those white people meant them no harm, meant them no good, and so they were very much taught to question. She also encouraged her children to read Black nationalist newspapers, and taught them math and psychology. So when Malcolm emerges as this brilliantly educated person, and the autobiography of Malcolm X and the movies talk about, there was a time in his life when he got behind on his schooling, and during the years of imprisonment, he had to catch up. But he was positioned to do that because he had come from this family and this mother who had already put a love of reading and writing and a curiosity in his heart. So you want to talk a little bit about how the family moved around, Marcie?
Absolutely. So Louise, when she was a relatively young lady after her grandmother passed away and the crash of the Sugarcane Society in 1917, she decided to take a trip once again, similar to what Berdis had done. She took a trip by herself and moved up to Montreal, where she was able to reconnect with one of her uncles, Edgerton Langdon, who introduced her to Garveyism and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Not only did she get involved, she also wrote articles for the Negro World, which was the newspaper of the Garvey movement. She had a really close relationship with Marcus Garvey and the Garvey family. So this wasn't, she was very involved, not just on the periphery, but very deeply involved and connected. While she was working as a recording secretary for the UNIA, she went on to meet, that was during the time she met Marcus Garvey, and ultimately met Earl Little, who is the father of her children, was the father of her children. He also was a minister as well. So because of the work that they did and the things that they were trying to do, actually up north, that's one of the things in the Midwest. It was very interesting for them to be so involved in the Midwest because we hear a lot about liberation and things happening maybe on the East Coast or even down south. But in the different places that they lived throughout the years, they tended to stay in the Midwest, which was very interesting and different, that was the path that they took. But no matter where they went, they wound up having to move multiple times due to white terrorism, even in the Midwest. So we know it does exist in the Midwest as well. In later years after Earl was murdered, Louise was responsible for raising all of their children, and ultimately through some of the struggles that she had in raising the children, as Faye mentioned, having social services and things like that come in, she ultimately was confined to a mental hospital where she stayed for 25 years. But it was 25 years because her children continued to fight and to make sure that they ultimately were able to bring her home.
Yes.
And because of that, Malcolm spent a lot of his life bouncing in and out of foster homes, which a lot of us know from previous things that we have read or seen. And then one of his sisters got custody of him when she was only 22 years old. Also, one thing about Louise is that there were times when she demonstrated her own militancy against white supremacy. Actually, during the time she was pregnant with Malcolm, there were some members of the Ku Klux Klan who came to their home and with guns and rifles and all kinds of things to threaten her. And her husband Earl happened to be away from home at the time, but she stood up to them, and basically, they wound up leaving. Even though they had shattered the windows of the home and things like that, she stood firm, pregnant with 3 children inside the home. She stood firm and made no apology for the work that her husband was doing. She also stood up once her husband Earl was brutally murdered, and by the white supremacist group called Black Legion in 1931. At that time, she refused to sell the land that they lived on and was basically that defiant spirit that ultimately we saw in her son, Malcolm X.
Yeah, she wasn't playing. So we have described the ancestry, the education, and the family life of Alberta, Berdis, and Louise. And they were amazing women who were the foundation of what their husbands would become. There are other women who influenced Malcolm X as well. As I mentioned before, initially I wanted to focus on Dr. Betty Shabazz, but of course we know a little bit about her, not as much as we would like. We know that not only was she a powerful force in her family's life when Malcolm was alive, but that she and her daughters, he had all girls, fought to maintain his legacy. And much of what we know about him now is because of the work that she did. She felt that it was her responsibility and the responsibility of her daughters, not again just to promote the legacy of Malcolm X, but that they had a responsibility to help all Black people. And then, of course, there's Ella Little Collins, who is his sister. And whenever you read about Malcolm X, whether it's this book or whatever, you kind of see her as the architect of moving the family towards Islam. And he describes his sister as the first really Black woman that he'd ever seen. And she was an entrepreneur. And it appears that she was able to help the family financially, which again gave them some ability to pursue various dreams. So she is really at the heart of his radicalism. And when he gets ready to go to Mecca, it is she who finances the pilgrimage. Another woman that I came across who I did not know anything about as a big influencer is someone named Vicki Garvin, and that's Vicki with an I, if you want to do a little bit more research on her. But she was she was one of, they say, several Black female activists who helped build the underpinnings of Malcolm X's political, economic, and philosophical ideas. And of course, it's very easy for women like that to get lost in history. And also, again, talking about Malcolm X's sister, Bell Hooks, the famous feminist writer, she takes to task the movie, the autobiography of Malcolm X, on many levels. But one of the things that she felt was the biggest disservice in that movie was, in the movie, it appears that Malcolm was radicalized by other prisoners in the prison, which was just so far from the truth. But that's just an example of how Hollywood, I guess, they felt that it wasn't interesting enough or compelling enough to talk about the role that his sister played, because we're all socialized to feel that male leadership is superior. All of the mothers were alive when their sons died. And according to our author, when she did her research, there were many, or not many, but enough times questions were asked about their fathers and wanting to know more about their fathers, but she couldn't find anything where people were curious about the role that these mothers played in their lives or how they were handling the grief of losing a child. So when you hear the name Malcolm, I want you to think, oh, that was Louise Little's boy. When you hear James Baldwin, I want you to go, that was Alberta Baldwin's firstborn. And of course, when you hear Martin Luther King Jr., you should know that Alberta, his mama, played a big role, and that his grandmama was a preacher. I enjoyed the book, and I hope you did too. And Marcie will give you kind of the last word on the book and your thoughts. Have that.
All right. Well, I have something that I want to share as well. I really enjoyed reading the book along with you, Faye. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this with you. As you know, one of the things I do with Brown Girl Collective is to share the stories of women, and admittedly so, I had not. Now, perhaps I have. I'm pretty sure I did Martin Luther King's mother, because there were some things that also went on with her even after his passing, and the way that, unfortunately, tragically, she lost her life as well. So her, yes, but the other mothers, I will admit, like you, I had never taken the time to really look into them or to see who they were or what they were about. So I do feel that this was a great thing to read, especially at this time, and just to recognize that, you know, any child that is born of a mother, and that many times those mothers do play a significant role in the people that they become, and that it's important for them to tell their story, to learn their stories, and even for those of us who are mothers, making sure that we're telling our stories as well, because our stories matter, not just the stories of the men that may be in our circles. So, well, along those lines, and this, I found a poem that it's not just about these particular mothers, but just Black mothers in general. And this is called An Homage to Black Madonnas by Margaret Burroughs. Venerable Black women, you of yesterday, you of today, Black mothers of tomorrow yet to be. These lines are homage to you, for you. Magnificent Black women, the poets and singers have been remiss, have sung too few poems and songs of you, and the image makers have not recorded your beauty. Sheba, Nefertiti, Zedutu, Cleopatra, Black women, mothers of humanity, mother original, your Black children here salute you. You bartered, sold, insulted, raped, and defiled, debased and debauched for 4 centuries. Strong women, Gannett, Tubman, and Truth. Weary Black women, your breasts gaunt from nurturing theirs first, and later sustaining yours, caring for theirs, at the same instance providing for yours also. Women forgotten, Mandy, Melindy, Cindy, and Lisa. Gentle Black women, while being hated yet teaching love, being scorned yet teaching respect, being humiliated and teaching compassion. Humble women, Bessie, Maddie, Lucy Ann, and Willie Mae. Resourceful Black women with tact, managing to make do, alter clothing, stretch meals, making room, priding, bolstering, nudging us on, protecting, teaching, survival. Laney, Bethune, Keckley, Terrell, and Brown, militant Black women, defending yours with fury, standing firm, picketing and demonstrating, kneeling in, sitting in, and waiting in, standing, walking, marching, and boycotting. Parks, Wells, Pleasant, and Louvestre. Discerning Black women, women of genius, setting your children a proper example, teaching each generation must do its part to improve life for those coming after. Nanny, Gaines, Burroughs, Maggie Walker, courageous Black women, brave and fearless, seeking to make a home among the unfriendly, sending your children off to school to pass unscathed through walls of hate. Lucy, Bates, Richardson, and Hamer, angry Black women, and understanding, aware of efforts to stunt your men, yet urging them manhood again. Diana, Gloria, Thelma, Ethel, Eva, and Marion, heroic Black women, women of glory, not turning back, never giving up, equaling, surpassing the stature of any race of women, anywhere, anytime. Billy, Ella, Dinah, Ciceretta, Mahalia, Black women of genius, brilliant women, walking through hateful valleys in dignity, strength, and such serene composure that even your enemies tremble insecure. Hansberry, Talbert, Bonds, and Baker, magnificent Black women, hopeful women, believing that trouble don't last always, knowing this truth, that those who are slaves today may well be the masters tomorrow, even sooner. Sisters with all women, Black women, your sufferings echo those of the oppressed. Join together, all of you, in a universal cry for peace and the good life for all. The world listens.
A universal cry. Thank you so much. Thanks all of you for listening in. I'm sure that if you read the book, or those of you who've read the book, it's going to influence you in a number of ways and make you really more curious to investigate Black women. I would also recommend that all of you go to the Girls Trek Black History Boot Camp. You can find out lots of great information there. And here at the 1960s Project, May is for Malcolm. Please listen to our broadcast that was last week. There's an amazing conversation with one of the founders of Malcolm's Organization of African Unity, and you will get a firsthand account of how that happened. Of course, we want you to share me and Marcie. And there will be 2 other discussions about Malcolm X. And I think one of them will also be about Malcolm in Africa, as well as a discussion of the actual autobiography of Malcolm X. So once again, thanks for tuning in. Please share, share, share. And I'll be back in a couple months, I think. Good night or good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Have a good one. Thank you, Faye.
Oh, you're welcome.
And thank you, Jerome.